Yeah, he's not saying that there's some sort of formula. Oh, you didn't know, or you didn't really understand, so it's okay. Like, that's not what Paul's saying. Paul knows what he did wrong, and he's not shying away from that. Um, he was acting on the knowledge that he understood. Could he have acted better? Yeah. He had the scriptures. He knew what the prophets said about the coming Messiah, but he was blinders. We talk about that a lot. I struggle with it. So he said that, and he uses that again to just really marvel at God's grace, even though he was acting with blinders, and he should have and could have known better, should have known better. Yeah, he was still violently opposing Christ's followers. It reminds me of Christ's prayer on the cross when he says, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." When I think about that, it's really intense. It's really powerful to think about Christ saying that about us when we think that we're doing right, but we're sucking for him. We think that we're doing right so many different times, or we have good intentions, but it's still falling short. People think they're doing right, but they're tearing up their families. They're raising their kids by some whatever worldly wisdom or idiotic standard, and then they wonder why their kids grow up to be rotten little punks. People get divorced. They think they're doing right by getting divorced because it's best for the situation, or it's best for you and I, or it's best for the kid. They think that is right and okay. People think that they're treating their bodies right. I think Josh handed Michaela the other day like a can of organic Rockstar. I like the Rockstars too, guys. I like the organic Rockstars, but we think that they're doing right by grabbing this organic thing. We think that my brother does this, so it reminds me of this. But you guys know what vaping is? It's like e-cigarettes, basically. People walk around with their little Doctor Who contraption-looking thing. It doesn't have fiberglass or whatever 1,000 chemicals that are in this cigarette. So they think that they're doing right by choosing this option instead. I think the jury's still out on that. I don't know enough about it personally to make a stand some way, but I have to wonder, and we talk about this a lot, like I said, because my brother does it, but what goes into those? They're called juices, for the record, the little things you put in it to get your Cinnamon Toast Crunch flavored smoke or whatever. What goes into those? I don't know, but I can't be good. But they think that they're doing right. So what are we doing in our lives where we think we're doing right, but we're failing to see a bigger picture? Paul thought he was doing right by doing this. He thought he was doing right by God by chasing down these people because he didn't believe in who Jesus said who he was. Paul thought he was doing right, but he was blinded. So this is where Paul's coming from in verse 13, where he says, God had mercy on me because I acted ignorantly and unbelief. Yeah. Like I said, he's not making excuses. He knows the person he is. I think that's an important distinction. We talked about it last night. He knows where he comes from, and he doesn't shy away from that. And he uses that, again, to just really highlight the power of Christ and God when we accept him and when we believe in who he said who he is and the work that he did and the sacrifice that he made. So this is where Paul's coming from. Like I said, it took me a while to kind of understand that because it makes it sound like it's okay in at least in my version, like but and because. Like it makes it sound okay, you know? But that's not what he's saying, and I want to make that clear. Then he says, this is a trustworthy saying. He does this a few times in these pastoral epistles, and it's similar to how Christ does it. You know, Christ throws out this like formula of words where he's like, the saying is true, or something of that variation, and that's usually sort of a pay attention type moment. God came into the world to save sinners. And he follows that up again. This whole thing is about Paul and where he came from and what God had done for Paul. So he follows that up with, in some version it says of who I'm the chief or something, talking about himself as a sinner, or who I am the worst of. So Paul's not, I mentioned it, Paul's not forgetting who he is now, because of Christ. Paul's not in like this, man, I just keep being reminded of our conversation last night, Alex. Paul's not in this state of guilt and like stagnant place, He's saying that like he recognizes who he was and that's powerful when we have Christ, when whatever our past like indiscretions were, we have to be careful with them, safeguard against them, be aware that we have a tendency towards those things. Paul mentions it as a thorn in his side in 2 Corinthians. He says, let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. We'll start at the beginning of chapter 12, go to about verse 10 or so. This boasting will do no good, but I must go on. I will reluctantly tell about visions and revelations from the Lord. I was caught up to the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Only God knows. Yes, only God knows whether I was in my body or outside of my body. But I do know that I was caught up to paradise and heard things go out astounding that they cannot be expressed in words, things no human is allowed to tell. That experience is worth boasting about. This is where I really want to focus. That experience is worth boasting about, but I am not going to do it. I will boast only about my weakness. If I wanted to boast, I would be no fool in doing so, because I would be telling the truth. But I won't do it, because I don't want anyone to give me credit beyond what they can see in my life or hear in my message, even though I have received such wonderful revelations from God. So to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and keep me from becoming proud. 3 times I begged the Lord to take it away. Each time he said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So that is exactly what Paul is doing in chapter 1 here. He's boasting about his weaknesses because it glorifies the strength of Christ. Some of us struggle with sexuality or pride or laziness, impatience, any number of things. Even though we are new creations, we should recognize that was part of our life, and we should safeguard against it. And then once we give it to God, we should use it. Use it in our interactions, in our relationships when talking about God. I feel like I'm a broken record because I'm pretty sure I've said this every sermon I've gave, but the importance of sharing your experiences, right, guys? And how it's much more effective than just doing this type of thing. Hebrews 12 says, "Let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. We do this by keeping our focus on Christ, the champion who perfects our faith." And that just harkens back to the discipline that we're supposed to be living with, like Josh was preaching about last week. So then he goes on in verse 16. I got to find my chapter, Timothy, again real quick. There we go. "But God had mercy on me so that Christ could use me as a prime example of his great patience with even the worst sinners." So, I can't remember if I already mentioned this. So, yeah, God used Paul at a specific time, like Paul was, as I said, he was like the worst of them, of the persecutors, He violently and eagerly sought out these people and wanted them thrown in jail or killed or whatever. So God waited for this, and he sought Paul out, and how much more effective is Paul now because of that, And Paul wasn't just some Joe Schmo, I think we all know Paul's background. He was like a really smart guy. He was trained up in these different philosophies and languages, and he was a Jew, but he was a Roman. Jew, but a Roman. So Paul had a status. He had a status as like a learned man, and then he had a status as this really awful man, this persecutor. So how much more effective that God uses someone like this to show his grace. I tried to think of an example that's relevant to our lives. I was trying to think of your biggest hater and how you could use them, but I don't know. I couldn't think of anything that is even close to as sort of profound of a move, a strategic move on God's part. So he uses his background to highlight this. We have our buzzword pop up there again. You guys remember the Greek word? Verse 16. It's a buzzword in our church. Macrothumia. Paul holds himself up to Timothy and says, don't get discouraged when you're out there in the fields. You'll stumble, but God is with you, and you lean to him, and don't be discouraged. Yeah, the struggle sucks over time, but how much greater do we become when we own own that struggle and appreciate like Christ knowing that, knowing us on that intimate level, knowing our struggles and then using them. There was like 2 or 3 songs that we just sang. God who sees me, God who keeps me, God who hears me, help me stand, help me stand. I was really thinking about this, my sermon and those words and how they're applicable. So, yeah, I guess be encouraged. Be encouraged. Know where you come from. Know that you are a new creation in God because of Christ. Own who you are and who you were, and use them to glorify the grace of God and what you're capable of now that He takes that from you. Yeah, don't be living with blinders or struggle with that. Always be asking yourself that. We have an awesome church who helps keep us accountable in that way. It's like I said, it's something I struggle with all the time. I wasn't going to go to this baby shower because I guess I specifically struggle with it in Eldership Academy because, I feel the burden of what we're doing in Eldership Academy, what I'm doing right now, and sometimes I want to do what's right by that, but I miss the point, the bigger, what's more important, So don't live with those blinders on. Ask yourself if you are when you start to develop that attitude, if you can recognize that about yourself. How do you handle grace? How do you give grace? How are you patient like Christ was patient? We're to be living like Him, so we should be suffering like Him. We should be forgiving like Him. It's hard. It's really hard for me. I'm pretty harsh on people in general before I even know them. And then when I do know them and see them struggling, it's like, But we're called to be like Christ. Christ suffered for us. He was patient with us. How has God used your struggles to benefit Him? How do you use your struggles to benefit or to point to Him? What have your interactions been? Are you using them or not? And yeah, that's what I want you guys to discuss and think about. Thanks. Break.